All right, here we are with Elizabeth Barrett Browning, another 19th century author, so lived in the 1800s. And we actually read a couple works of hers this week. One is called Toujours Sand, a Desire. Toujours Sand, a Recognition. That's another one. And finally, a third one from Sonnets from the Portuguese. So it's number 18 we'll be reading. So it's one of the sonnets from her bigger work called Sonnets from the Portuguese. All right, so 3 different poems, 2 that are directed towards George Sand, who we've mentioned before. I don't know if you remember, but George Sand is actually a female poet from the time period too, and friends with Elizabeth Barrett Browning. George Sand's real name was Aurora Dupin, and she used the name George Sand, which looks like George Sand, as a name she would publish under. Because again, remember, women had often to obscure their identities. That may have been one of her motivations for using a male pseudonym, but we shall talk about it some more in just a little bit. If you look at the written lecture, there is a portrait of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. There's so many portraits out there because she was a very famous poet in her own right in the 1800s, so very well known. The written out lecture also has some website links to check out if you would like to know more information about Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And there's biographical and literary information on her at poets.org. That's one of the links. And another one, oh, this is fun, is about her historic love story with Robert Browning. So that's where the Browning part of her last name comes from. She was born Elizabeth Barrett, and then she married Robert Browning, so became known as Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So there's a literary ladies guide that's got information about that love story. And there's also a web link here to watch the Norma Shearer movie. Norma Shearer is the actress who plays Elizabeth Barrett in the 1934 movie called The Barretts of Wimpole Street. And that chronicles Elizabeth's romance with Robert Browning. And there was a 1957 remake of the same film with the same name. That's available for rental or purchase through Amazon.com if you ever wanted to check that one out. But I have the one that was made in 1934 with Norma Shearer playing Elizabeth Barrett. And that is through a Facebook link to a movie that you can watch there if you want to. It's kind of an intriguing story. So it is fun to watch. Anyway, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, she is British again. She lived from 1806 to 1861, and she died at the age of 55 years old. So again, not what we would call a long life, but longer than many of the poets we've read about, right? Certainly longer than, oh my goodness, all the people in Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley's life, although Shelley herself died at 53, so about the same age as Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Anyway, she was born Elizabeth Barrett in England and married famed poet Robert Browning, 6 years her junior. That means he was 6 years younger than she is. So that was also very, non-traditional for the time, even for nowadays, I think. Of course, you can marry whoever you want, right? And plenty of times people marry people that are older than they are, but it's not as common to see a woman marrying someone younger than she is. So this man was 6 years younger than she was. She's the oldest of 12 children. Wow. She outdid me. That is, not she, her mother. Her parents outdid me, right? Yeah, they had 12 children. She was the oldest of them. So it must have been quite a household. She probably had a lot of responsibility, I'm assuming, as the oldest and a female oldest at that, of 12 children. She was the daughter of a stern father and a submissive mother. They were moneyed from possessions in Jamaica, so they had money. Elizabeth's family provided her an excellent education, with which she began writing poems as possibly as early as 4 years of age. So they had wealth to be able to provide her this education, since, free education wasn't really provided to women at that time or maybe to anyone, actually, now that I think about it. But obviously, institutions were open, a lot more institutions were open to men at the time, but, her family was able to provide her an education. Um, so she started writing poems as early as 4 years of age. Four. I said 4. Yeah. 4. Could you imagine? Most kids don't even know how to write then, read or write, much less compose poetry. So pretty amazing. Her father paid for the private publication of her epic poem that she composed, called The Battle of Marathon. And she composed that at the age of 14. Yes, 14. And her father liked it so much, he paid for it to be published himself. So pretty neat. She had a father, obviously, even though he was stern, he facilitated not only her education, but her literary career here. At age 15, Elizabeth's doctor began prescribing her opium to take for nervous breakdowns that she was experiencing. So, yeah, kind of sad, right? That she was experiencing nervous breakdowns, but her doctor prescribed her opium to try to stop them. Opium. Opium's not good for you. No. So here she is at a very young age, 15. Frontal cortex isn't fully formed yet, and she's taking opium already. People did not understand a lot about this stuff, like what it would do to the body. So sometimes they're like, oh, well, it has this effect. Why don't you try that? And this stuff was not regulated or legislated either. Anyway, in 1828, when Elizabeth was only 22, her mother died. Then, in 1838, when Elizabeth was 32, her brother Samuel died. Later, in the very same year, her beloved brother Edward, whom she called Bro, drowned in a sailing accident. When he was Elizabeth's personal companion in Torquay. Yeah. So they were traveling together, and he died in a sailing accident. So I can imagine there may have been some guilt involved there, because she was living there in Torquay with her brother because she was considered sickly and an invalid, and they went there for a better climate, hoping that would help cure her. I'm sure those nervous breakdowns and the opium and things like that also didn't help with her health. These deaths were more than Elizabeth could bear. So she confined herself to her infamous back room, or her infamous sick room, I should say, back on Wimpole Street. So she went back home, in other words, to her family's house on Wimpole Street at the age of 32. And she just called it her sick room, and she just laid there on a couch. She wouldn't leave. Well, she would barely leave. It was just, she was already sickly with nervous breakdowns and having to live, trying to live in other climates to cure herself. But then after these tragic deaths, she had mother, brother, and then beloved brother die, who was accompanying her. Her companion at the time drowned. So she just went home, and she just stayed in her sick room. She rarely left the room and saw only a few visitors from time to time. Perhaps, though, the sick room was Elizabeth's room of her own. Remember, we talked about how important that is for women to be able to write, to have a room where they can concentrate and focus and not have to worry about earning a living, and can devote the time they need to writing, because writing takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes time and effort and planning and cultivation, rewriting. So she wrote while she was there. She wrote, in fact, voluminously while she was there. That means she wrote a lot. She wrote a lot. She didn't have anything else to do. Maybe it kind of helped her too. Give her something to focus on, right? After trying to recover from these very tragic deaths. She, in fact, was seriously considered for the highly esteemed position of poet Laureate of England when William Wordsworth died in 1850. Now, as you recall, William Wordsworth, you've heard about him before. He was the famous poet laureate brother of Dorothy Wordsworth. So, Letitia was considered to replace him when he died in 1850 because of how much she wrote and how well she wrote, the quality of her poetry. In 1845, Robert Browning, well, let me back up, not only because of the quality of her poetry, but the fame of her poetry. She was well known. She was well known. In fact, in 1845, 5 years before William Wordsworth died, and she was considered for poet laureate, Robert Browning, who didn't know her, he sent Elizabeth a fan letter in which he proclaimed his love for her and her writing. So he fell in love with her through her writing. Because she got that fan letter from him, she allowed him to visit her. A year and a half later, the two eloped. Yeah. So he sent the fan letter, she allowed him to visit her, and then 1.5 years later, they eloped, got married. Yeah, so it's a pretty exciting and romantic love story, as I mentioned before. Her father, that stern father, remember that she had, prohibited any of his children from marrying. Yeah, kind of weird. I don't know why. Maybe he was worried about them. Maybe after his wife died, and I don't know, very clingy, I guess, or really wanted to control their lives. I don't know. I don't get it. But anyway, he would not let her get married, didn't want his children to get married for his other children. Robert Browning came into this sick room and to this situation where her father was not, encouraging his children to marry. And he kind of rescued her from the sick room. He all of a sudden brought life into that and visited her and brought life into that invalidism and seclusion that she had been submitting herself to. And the two provided each other support and inspiration as writers. So she encouraged him as a writer, and he also became a famous poet too. And he encouraged her. Elizabeth, he helped her get out of that room. Elizabeth even became a political activist for Italian unification. So at the time, Italy was broken up into all these little kind of like little kingdoms or dukedoms. And Italy wanted to unify so they could become a stronger nation instead of all these tiny little dukedoms like, Venice was pitted against Rome, which was pitted against Florence. They all had their own little independent governments. And so they wanted to unify and become a single country so they could become stronger because they were confronting all these other nations that were bigger. So she was a political activist for Italian unification. Also, she was an activist for the abolition of slavery. So that speaks a lot to her character, that she thought that people should not be enslaved. She wanted them to be free. And she also was an activist for women's rights. Well, that makes sense, right? She's a woman and she's suffering at home in her sick room, not being encouraged to marry, but also being confronted with the loss of rights when a woman does marry, right? So she recognized those concerns and fought for women's rights. And she was also interested in the spiritualist movement. So that was kind of like people were interested in, we had the Great Awakenings, which brought religious fervor, particularly in the United States. But then there was also the talk about, a spirit, people having spirits, and maybe people, with the science fiction of the time becoming a more popular genre, people kind of turning into the occult a little bit and being interested in whether the spirit, if it does live on after death, maybe we can communicate with it, so that, was also a factor in her life. Elizabeth suffered several miscarriages, kind of like we talked about, how Mary had that horrible, or Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley had that horrible miscarriage and had lost 3 children. Well, Mary suffered several miscarriages herself. Again, it's an era where we didn't know a lot about what kind of care maybe all women needed, or during pregnancy, or what kind of care maybe the babies needed after birth to save them, or people in general when they got ill. So anyway, she gave